I believe we are live today. Can you run Istio successfully without knowing Envoy configuration or understand Envoy access log? Maybe in demos or POC, but sooner or later, you will find you need to understand them, especially when you need to run them in production environment. Welcome to Hoot livestream today. We will dive into Debug Envoy config and analyze access logs so you can be confident when hitting issues when running Istio or Envoy in your production environment. This is Len. I'm the host for the Hoot livestream today, where we bring Istio, Envoy, Kubernetes, eBPF, and GraphQL technology to you so you can be very well prepared at your job and be the best. I am so excited to have Denis and Greg join me today. They are our expert of debugging Envoy at Solo. In fact, they actually created some of the toolings to help us to do the job better when we work with our user community. Greg, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Greg Hansen. I'm a pretty new hire here to Solo, but I've been working on the Istio project since day one. So I'm a lifer when it comes to Istio.
I would say day zero, not day one.
Day zero, true. Yes, I worked on similar open source projects that eventually got folded into Istio. So yes, if anything, negative one.
That's awesome. Hey, Denis, can you introduce yourself too?
Yeah, I see the sun is coming exactly at the same time. So I am Denis and I am at Solo since close to 2 years now, and I am director of field engineering in EMEA.
That's awesome. Yeah, I know Denis is one of our experts at Solo that he really makes stuff happen and he can always pull out the crazy performance numbers regarding Envoy and Istio. So let's get to the news for this week. IstioCon is coming next week. Can you believe it? So if you haven't registered for IstioCon, make sure you register today. We are really excited about the agenda of IstioCon next week. It's totally free and it's virtual. Solo has released general availability of GraphQL support for Glue. So if you're interested in exploring GraphQL, take your application to the next level. Check this out for our Glue support for GraphQL. Istio also released a new release of Istio 113.3. This is an important release that fixes a critical bug for many of our users. I believe, Denis, you actually running into this bug working with our users when you have a cross namespace of virtual system. If you are, using virtual service delegation or using virtual service across different namespace, different cluster, it's going to be ignored without this fix. So the fix is also in Istio 1.12.6. So make sure you update to these Istio releases. Last but not the least, I also want to provide an update to our upcoming Hoot episodes. So we're not going to have a Hoot next week due to IstioCon, but in the first week of May, we're going to have Christian Poster coming back to talk about Istio and VM and spell integration. We'll also have some more episodes planned afterwards. So make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't get, so you always get notified for any of our new episodes. That's the news. Let's go to some of my questions for the speakers today. Let's see. So the first question I want to ask is for you, Denis and Greg. How long have you been debugging Istio and Envoy? Denis, you want to take that first?
Yeah, I can. I was just looking at getting rid of the sun. So yeah, I think I started to work before joining Solo. I started to work on Istio, but not so much on debugging at that time. So it was more like playing around. But since in the last 2 years, obviously helping customers on both our API gateway, Glue Edge based on Envoy and Istio, like on a daily basis since 2 years.
That's a lot of experience. What about you, Greg? I guess it would be 5 plus your -1.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess it depends on which debugging you're referring to, because, I mean, going back to the earliest days of Istio, obviously just debugging the Istio code and making sure that the Istio control plane was spitting out the correct Envoy configuration files that we were expecting to get default routing working between all of our sidecars. So that's one type of debugging. And then, of course, definitely something that's picked up in the past few years as Istio has taken off is debugging. Basically, my expertise in Istio is how the various virtual service entries, destination rules, and all those other fun CRDs translate into an Envoy configuration file. So when something doesn't work, why is my request failing? I became that guy to go to. So I've been parsing access logs for a while to help debug questions.
Yeah, I know I've gone to both of you for some of my issues in the past. So what are the tools out there to help user debug Istio and Envoy today from your perspective? Greg, you want to take that first?
Sure. Let's see. Well, Istio itself has a really great tool that I know I use. I mean, I'm a developer on Istio, so I might be a little biased on that front, and that tool is Istio CTL. I find myself constantly using that to peek at the generated configs for Istio. But going further, something that I personally have found is, let's see, at KubeCon in North America 2019, I heard about this really neat tool called OnGuard. And it was a way to basically spit out a nice JSON pretty printed version of an access log. Because if you haven't seen an access log, I don't know, Lynn, you want to share my screen?
Yes.
There's a lot of stuff in there, and this is a really good picture, just kind of representing all that information jammed into a single line and everything that you can learn from it. So just being able to parse that into a nice little JSON pretty print structure, you can actually see what everything is in there rather than having to look up the hard-coded format in the Istio source code. So I saw this. I thought it was great. And I started pointing people to this anytime they had debug questions that they were pointing my way. And basically, they would say, here's an access log. Why is my request failing? I'm just like, well, can you run it through OnGuard and tell me what it shows? And of course, the next thing they do is they just present me the OnGuard output, and they don't actually look at any of the fields and figure out what's going wrong. So I'm still kind of a middleman in that situation. So going a little bit further, I actually wrote my own little UI tool, cleverly named OnGuard Viewer. And basically, it combines OnGuard with a nice little UI. And this UI, basically, it prints out the OnGuard JSON output, but also it goes directly to the Envoy docs and pulls the docs directly and links them to each of the fields as you click on them. So this way, you can click on a log field and know exactly what it's saying. And so this became the new thing that I was pushing on all the customers that were coming to me with debug questions. Basically trying to encourage people to self-learn a little bit more about Envoy itself and take more off of my workload.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess we have a question coming from Bojans. Hi, thanks for joining us. Is there some UI tool to recommend? Looking at 1K of JSON is painful. That's a great question.
I think I
Denis,
will
do
like
you
this
want?
question, right? Yeah, I think we can go through that, but perhaps we should just go through the perhaps other parts of the access logs and really look at the full power of that before we switch to this, because it's a really good topic, right? Like basically there's these access logs that you get that tells you a lot about what's going wrong. And then you have this big config dump, like Bojan is speaking about, right? That you want to look at when you want to understand, how you configured everything, right? But I think before we jump into this, config dump thing on the access log, I think that's one of the things I have seen a lot when I was helping customers, that most of the people who are using Istio on Envoy, they don't even know that there is this response flag, right? And this response flag is like a lifesaver, right? When you are working on Istio, right? Like you have this 503 and you don't know where to look at. This response flag is really the go-to place where you can really understand why I have a 503, right? And I think it's really the first thing that you look at, right? And you have the example here, right? So it's really neat because you have this list of flags and the full description here.
Yeah, this is one of those things where I would get OnGuard output and I would immediately have to go to the Envoy docs just to see what exactly these response flags translate to and figure out why my request might be failing based on the response flag. So I know I said I wrote this for customers, but really I use this all the time.
Yeah, it's exactly what I was thinking about. Like in my case, I look at the access logs, I see the flag, and I never remember them, right? And then I go to Google. I think one of my top search is Envoy access logs, because I know if I type Envoy access logs, I directly go to the documentation page where I have these response flags.
I am definitely in the same boat there.
Yeah, I know the only thing I can remember, I think it's UC upstream connection error or something 503, because that's what mostly happens in Istio. That's great. So let's go to anything else you guys want to add?
Oh, yeah. I guess one other new thing that's come in, I believe in Istio 112 or 113 later, is we've really started getting the response code details better for logging, especially for TLS errors. So specifically like TLS certs or an SNI mismatch, some of those are getting exposed directly in the access logs now, whereas before you would have to crank up the Envoy proxy logging verbosity level, the tracer debug to actually see the TLS errors that Envoy was sitting. Whereas now they're actually coming up in the access logs themselves, which is really helpful.
That's a great tip. Okay, so my next question goes to Denis. Why did you develop the Envoy UI tool? I assume it's specifically for the purpose that Bangjian was asking.
Exactly, that's exactly what's happening. Like, yeah, if you don't mind sharing my screen, I can go through a quick demo, so it will probably be easier for people to understand, the idea behind it, right? So you are probably most of you, familiar with the book info application, right? And you can find the details if you go to the documentation. You have this product page talking to the reviews with 3 versions and the details, and the reviews talking to ratings, right? And it looks like that, right? So let's say you have deployed this and you want to change something, right? You want to change, like, instead of having like half and half, you want to have like most of the requests going to the V1, for example, right? So I could just like create like a virtual service like that, right? And I could just like apply it, and I would go there, right? And I would see an error like it's not available, right? And for that purpose, that's really a configuration error in the Istio side, right? So the good thing is that because it's a configuration error in Istio, right, I can run the Istio cutter we spoke before, right? And it's very obvious, right? I have this virtual service, that reference some subsets, but I don't have a destination rule for them, right? So it's good, right? I don't need like to go and parse my 1,000 lines of code for this, right? I can just, create like this destination rule that describe this subset, right? And if I apply it, and let me know if it's too small, Lynn, and I can, make it bigger.
Yeah, a little bit bigger would be nice. I think people can see it, but yeah, that's perfect.
Sounds good. Even this one, I think I can make it bigger.
Yeah, the book info is especially small.
So
yeah, that's great.
So here now you see everything is fine, right? I can have like most of the time it goes to V1, which is no stars, and 10% of the time it goes to V2. And again, if I look at the analyze, now it's pretty happy, right? Everything is fine. So that's kind of the issue that you don't need my tool for, right? It's like an Istio configuration error, right? But now, let's say you do something that is really valid in terms of Istio, right? Let's say I just say I change the matcher here, so it's only when the source is on port 80, right? And in that case, if I apply it, let me apply this one. Too many of them. If I apply this, right, and I run the analyze, still everything is happy, right? Because I didn't make any mistake in the configuration of Istio, but now the behavior is not what I expect, right? It's half of the time it goes to V1 and half of the time of V2, and I don't understand what can be wrong here, right? And basically for this, that's where you start to go to this, proxy config commands, right? And you can do like a proxy config all, or you can do like a proxy config root. Let me just go back to, this is not the right one. So in my case, it's here. So you get like the all, but you can also just get like the root, for example, right? So you can see what are the roots configured here. You can see, like as I said, the all here. You could also say this is like a representation of the configuration that is not too complicated to understand, right? It's kind of a summary. I can probably like just put it a little bit smaller so that it makes more sense. So you can see when I do the all, I get the roots and the clusters and so on. You could also do like this all minus O JSON, right? And that starts to be like a bigger one, right? So that's the one that we were discussing about before. It's pretty small configuration. I already have like 17,000 lines of code, right? So it starts to be quite complicated, right? So that's where I build this Envoy CTL first. So that was like a kind of a command line to try to digest this and show that in a table view so that it's easy to understand, the most important part of the configuration, right? So it's like open source. You can, take a look at it. I built that before the UI, and then I built the UI on top of it. So if I show like Envoy CTL, you can see here, I do it on the product page, for example. Oops, sorry. And there I need to take it a bit smaller, right? So what you can see here is that it shows me like for each listener, it shows me like the roots and but you see I have like some good amount of configuration here, right? Let me try to go to the header of it so that it's easier to understand. So if I go at the beginning of it, you see here I have like the listener and the root name, the domain, which is what really the most important part, right? Like that's where I send the request, the matcher, the root configuration, and some information about the clusters, right? So you can do it that way and get all the information, or you can filter. I just want to have the roots that are for the reviews services, right? And then I have less of them, and I can start to see what's wrong with my configuration, right? Because this is the way Istio has translated that into Envoy, right, in my proxy. And I can see here that for my review service, which I target, so you remember in the UI, I have like this product page service that calls the review service. So for this review service, I can see I have one route for the port 80 and one route for the port 9080. And the one for 9080 doesn't have any special configuration. And the one for 80 has my 90-10 split, right? So because of that, I know that something is wrong, right? That I understand that there is no issue in my Istio configuration. It's just that what I didn't create the rule for the right target, basically. And I can let me just also capture like a config dump so we can use it later. So I can just like keep this config dump. But now if I go and again I just apply what was this file here. If I fix my problem here, right, I put like 9080 like it was before, and I apply it. Then if I just like go back to my command here, I can see I fixed my problem, right? Because I have only the root for 9080 now, which has this weight, right? And you've seen it before working, right? So I will not go back to the page, right? So I started with this, which was quite good. But you see, I started to add this -d option. I don't know if you see it clearly here, right? So I started to add this -d option, to filter by that. But then I wanted to filter, by the root or finding all the root that have a specific information or whatever. And it started to be like really complicated for a CLI tool. So that's where I basically took this logic and built the Envoy UI. So here you've seen what I was doing here, that I just took my config dump. You can see it here, right? You take the JSON, output. It's just put that in a file, and then you go to this Envoy UI.solo.io, and you just select your config dump. And again, I just want for the reviews, right? So you just click reviews here, and you see it filters easily, right? But then I could do like 9080, right? So you can have like it's very easy to navigate, because you have all these filter options and sorting options that you don't really have in a CLI tool, right? And obviously the rest is kind of similar view, right? You have the cluster and endpoints and other things. And the other thing is that what I found out quickly is that it's good, but then generally you want to be going deeper when you found like you have an idea of the root cause. And that's why I put this JSON editor on the side so that I can just like search for all the iteration of this name here, and then I can see, right, like this is the cluster information for my v1 subset and for my v2 subset, and here I really have access to all the details, and I can start to really dig into the configuration, right? And I can obviously just like this is the cluster config dump, but can look at the listener or the roots and all these kind of things. And just before I see if you have questions, guys, one thing that people ask me very often is, okay, but what about security? Because I don't want to send my config dump to you guys, because it's even just the names are sensitive, right, in the company in many cases, right? So I just wanted to show you that basically everything you've seen here, right? Like if I refresh, you can see the network communications happening, right? It just downloads, this page. And now if I, take this config dump, you can see here, there is nothing that is sent, right? So basically everything is done client side. All this logic is implemented in JavaScript in the client side. So we don't have any data sent over the internet, and completely secure for that, right? So I wanted to mention that because I got this question quite often. I have another small extra thing I can show you after, but I'll probably pause here and see if there are questions and if you want me to jump into some details here.
Yeah, this is really great. So essentially, users should use the tools Istio provide, right? Istio Kado Analyze to help you with basic problem. But sometimes Istio Kado Analyze are not smart enough. Like in your example, you gave a port doesn't match, and you have to goes through the Envoy configuration, which many of you probably have gone through. And this is a really nice tool to help you understand the Envoy configuration to be able to filter and search. I think I personally like the UI better than the CLI. It just seems so much more easy to use. One question I have is, if user wants to run the UI on their local machine, is that possible today? Or
Yeah, I didn't do that. We didn't really open source that part. But
let's see.
yeah, but the logic is there, right? Let's say it's just that the CLI is always easy to maintain and push a new
Yep.
version if something is wrong. The UI is a little different story, right? If you find something wrong or whatever, it's a lot easier to let's do that as a SaaS if you wish, right? And as I said, because there is absolutely no data going through the internet, there is no real point in having running it locally. You see what I mean? Because it's kind of
Yeah,
exactly
that's
the
a
same.
good point.
I
Okay,
can show
yeah.
you an extra thing very quickly if you want. Is just like because even with this, sometimes it was not solving one of the problem I have, which is more like I do something and I don't know. I create something like a new resource and I don't know what it is doing in Envoy, right? It's something that happens quite often, I feel. And if you go to this tool, you can check out what's the full configuration, but it doesn't really show you like a diff between what you have before and what you had after you applied something, right? So here, let's say I have removed my virtual service, right? And I want to know when I apply this virtual service, what's happening in my Envoy configuration, or even when I do my both virtual service and destination role, what is happening, right? So for that, and I can show you the snippet after, right? I have a small snippet that I'm using quite often, which basically just every time I run it, it just tries to do a diff with what was the Envoy configuration before. And if I let me apply like this VS and apply like the DR as well. Now, if I run this diff, you see it just show me the portion of my thousands of lines codes, right, that has been changed, right, which is a lot smaller, right? So it's kind of like a few dozens lines. Sometimes it's even just changing like one line or whatever, right? So we can share that. I think you share notes after the hoot, right? So I can share with you the snippet, but it's really like you see it as easy as that, right? So basically it's like using the PC or JSON, right, putting in a temporary file and then doing using this JSON diff. It's a Node.js tool to just do the diff between the two, and I found that really useful in many cases.
Let me just add in,
Yeah.
it's a, I don't know, a really good, I guess, to be a Istio super user is understanding how the Istio CRDs impact a Envoy configuration. So like if you're having TLS problems, you should be looking at your listeners. If you are trying to route HTTP traffic and it's not behaving as you expect, you should be looking at the routes. If you define a destination rule and you're not seeing the expected behavior, you should be looking at your clusters. So just beginning to understand what CRDs you're creating and which parts of Envoy they impact is really giving yourself a good starting point for tools like this, because then I need to look at the listeners. I need to look at the routes. Are all the host names there that I'm expecting? Are all the SNIs in this listener there that I'm expecting? Those are just really good ways to start debugging a problem. And this tool is great for that.
And even I found like sometimes that when I was running it, basically the output was just no difference. So I was just realizing that the Istio object I was creating was just having no impact on the proxy I wanted to have an impact on, right? So it's just that it
Yeah.
was not like it's a very simple way to find also this kind of configuration error.
Yep, true. I always say the very first debugging step you should run is istioctl proxy status or istioctl ps, because you could create as many rules as you want, but if something else is broken in your environment that's preventing a config from being pushed, you're not going to see any of those rules to begin with. So always a good stepping point.
But that's probably because you are a very early adopter of Istio, right? Because in the last 5 or 6 versions, it's very rare that you have this kind of propagation issue, right? Compared to in the past where it was probably like happening a lot more, right? So for me, as a kind of user like that is only really intensively using Istio since 2 years, I didn't really use this command line, probably because it's quite solid now, right? So
Yeah, it was super useful at the early days of Istio, but now the problem is rare. Maybe when it's under stress, occasionally you would definitely need to check it, but most of the time it works. So we have user asking about the URL. So the URL Denis showed of the UI is envoy.ui.solo.io. And the Envoy cuddle command that you show to is this URL you can install. It's a CLI you can install yourself. Bonja also asked another question. Is there an API that you can expose from Envoy to the new config on the fly, not just with CLI and dump?
yeah, it's not there, right? It's like it could be a good thing, right? But the thing is that Envoy itself receives configuration and it only knows about the current configuration, right? It doesn't keep history of what was my previous configuration, right? It's kind of the role of the control plane to do that. You can implement, and we have that in our gateway, for example, where we have this proxy that you can put in the middle between your control plane and your Envoy instance to keep track of the previous last known config. And this kind of proxy in the middle could basically do this kind of div, but Envoy itself only knows one configuration. So it's difficult for it to know what has changed because it only knows what it needs to apply now, as far as I know. I mean, I could.
Yeah, Greg, do you have any comments?
Oh, I was just thinking if we wanted to do something like that, where it would go into place. And my train of thought just spiraled from there since I'm the developer. And I'd probably have to be something on the Istio agent side that would be basically catching and logging all the config pushes that it'd be receiving from the control plane. But even then, I guess that'd just be a log message. I'm not sure if that'd be dynamic enough for you or on the fly.
Yeah.
But
okay, so the answer is no, not today.
If you think there's a use case, be sure to put in a feature request on the Istio GitHub.
Yeah. And maybe that will prioritize someday. That sounds great. So we learned a lot about Denis' tool, about Envoy UI and Envoy CLI to help pass the Envoy configuration. Greg, do you want to show us something about your tool? Because the way now I'm understanding is user using Istio Cuddle to analyze the config. After the config is pushed to Istio of their Kubernetes cluster, they use Istio Cuddle proxy status first to make sure the configuration is synced properly to their Envoy proxy. And then after that, they are looking Envoy access log, which I think that will be the tool you develop would help. And then if that didn't give them enough hint, or maybe there's hint there, that's when they need to look at Denis' tool to kind of figure out Envoy configuration.
Yeah,
Is that a reasonable flow?
Yeah, there's just so much information stored in an access log that can definitely provide insights into an environment. Like if you're ever seeing pass-through cluster on any of your access logs, that's a good sign that you're having problems. Or if you're doing egress gateway routing and the access logs on your Istio proxy sidecar aren't pointing to your egress gateway that you're trying to route the traffic to. That's a sign that something's not working right in your routing. I would say that the answer depends. Just depends on the exact error that you're hitting. Unfortunately, that means you probably just have to try everything and to figure out the root cause.
Yeah, unfortunately. Okay, cool. Do you want to show us the demo of your tool, if you have one, Greg?
Oh, well, I do have it up and running right here. I don't have a particular error scenario planned out for this little demo, but I've basically downloaded my code from GitHub, and all I'm doing is just go run main.go, and that fires up a listener for localhost 9090. And so put that into my browser, and I paste my access log entry into there. And since I am using Istio, which has a unique access log versus Envoy's default access log, I have that little box checked and just hitting process. And depending on what field I want to know, I can click on the information. I know this, particularly the HTTP versus TCP log fields are important for people when they're debugging a log, because a lot of times they'll send me an access log and say, here's the failed request. And they'll send me in, and I'll put it in here. And it's a perfectly valid request. It's just a TCP access log. So a lot of the fields end up with just a little dash in it. And it's just like, at that point, is this an error? But I can look at the output and see that there's some bytes sent and some bytes received. So a request technically is going on here. It's just TCP, and therefore you're not going to see a lot of the other fields that are there by default in your access logs that you get with HTTP-based access logging. So that's always something good to make note of. And now I've noticed, as I had to update my tool, because now they have UDP-specific access log fields. So I had to update my logic in my parser to make sure I was displaying the UDP field specifically. So always something to keep in mind, because depending on what type of traffic you're having in your mesh, HTTP, TCP, TLS, your access logs are going to vary. So don't expect every access log to look the same. Yeah, I don't know. Any questions, I guess?
Yeah, we have another question from Wangjian.
Okay.
How would you debug one big virtual service with multiple virtual service match priority, especially if you have some overlaps and different type of match, rejects or prefix?
Yeah, I think that the config dump is probably the best place to find that, right? You would look at in the table at the name of your target, right? And then you would see the matcher, and you will have the full matcher there, right? So you will not have to navigate by yourself in the config dump to find it, and then you could see the Envoy configuration directly.
And something else with virtual services, you can actually specify a route name in the virtual service. So that way, that field will actually get logged in your access log, and it will show up, where is it? Route name. So by default, for the HTTP traffic, it's just Istio's generated name of default. But in your virtual service, you can actually specify a unique route name. And in your access log, you can verify which logic it's actually using on that particular request.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because in fact, this is also something that is useful in your config dump, basically. And I often think it's like granted, because in GlueMesh, our product that sits on top of Istio, right, we create these route names automatically. So we always get them, right? And in the config dump, it's really easier as well, because then you can just filter by your route name and access it directly.
Yeah, that's a really good tip. All right. Is there anything else, debugging tips you guys would like to share before we wrap up?
No, I don't have any other in mind. I think it's like Greg said, right? It's really good at the beginning to learn Istio by the examples and looking at the behavior that you get after you apply something. But as soon as you start to be really serious with it, it's really interesting to start to look at what is the corresponding envoy configuration. You will never read a full dump, right? That makes no sense. It's not for humans. It's for machines, right? But looking at a small part of it is very interesting. And then you could even discover, oh, there is this nice setting in Envoy. Is it exposed in Istio in one way or another, right? And then you can start to research and you find new options in Istio that you didn't even know, right? So it's quite interesting.
And then that opens up the door to Envoy filters. If you find super tiny small XYZ field that isn't exposed in Envoy, and then knowing how to apply that with an Envoy filter, just having a general knowledge of how the listeners, clusters, routes are constructed, so that when you are patching this Envoy object with this desired field that your Envoy filter is adding, you know how to construct your Envoy filter. And being able to look at just like the raw JSON, or use the Envoy UI tool, you know exactly how to define the object so that the fields merge as you expect them to.
Yeah, totally. I guess if you ever need to write your own Envoy filter, I can see Denis' config analyze tool can be really useful for you. By the way, I just sent out Greg's tool also, the viewer for InGuard. So feel free to check them out. With that, I want to take a minute to thank our fabulous speakers today, to show us their tips. Thank them for all the energy they put behind to create these tools so they are available for each of us to use. So how do folks reach out to you, Greg and Denis?
Well, I am on Twitter. I don't tweet much, but I am on there. But also, my repo's there. You can definitely open up issues and flag me that way. I promise I will respond.
Yeah, and for me, I would say like the same. If it's like an issue or an improvement in the tool, the GitHub repo is the best. Otherwise, we are always on Slack. Like we are kind of connected to Slack, right? So just go to the solo.io Slack and you will find us there all day. So that's probably the easiest way to interact with us.
Yeah, definitely. We are all on the solo Slack. This is great. Thank you so much again. And I also want to thank you, everyone, for joining us and watching this. I hope you find this interesting. If you do, please make sure give us a thumbs up and also click on the like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our future episodes. And also, if you have ideas on what you would like to see in one of our future live stream, please comment and let us know below. Thank you so much, and have fun at IstioCon next week. We will see you the first week of May. Thanks, everyone. Bye
Thanks,
now.
everyone. Thanks, Lynn. Bye-bye.